Hi, this is a presentation on the Cartography of Consciousness, Mapping the Unseen by Adrian Fonsale for ITP 7885 Advanced Topics, December 2024. Before we start, let's look at the lay of the land, the map of what we're going to try and do in the next 20 minutes. We're going to first off start by asking the question, what is a map? Looking at the definition and the history of maps and cartography. Then we're going to briefly jump into functions and characteristics of maps. We'll focus on the symbolic representation of the abstraction. Next, we'll jump into methods of mapping consciousness. We'll acknowledge the personal prism that influences any kind of map, especially when it comes to consciousness. We've kind of laid the groundwork for the crux of this presentation, which is looking at consciousness as a multi-dimensional object and what those implications are. So, what is a map? Harley and Woodward, in the History of Cartography, Volume 1, introduces the study of maps and cartography, highlighting their critical role in understanding space, society, and cultural throughout history. They emphasize that maps are not merely artifacts, but dynamic tools that facilitate spatial understanding of various concepts and processes in human and cosmological contexts. This definition proposes that maps are graphic representations that facilitate spatial understanding, thus freeing it from restrictive and cultural specific criteria. Edney, in his book Cartography, The Ideal and Its History, continues this train of thought. And refers to his etymology of the word map, which derives from the Latin word mappa, M-A-P-P-A, which refers to a cloth that is used for carrying items. He states that while this etymology is intriguing, it fails to capture the complexity of mapping practices and their social cultural implications. He continues by saying maps are not inherently neutral or immutable. They serve as vehicles for navigation, visualization, and exerting control over space, often reflecting power dynamics and the values of its creators. The modern ideal of the map as a universal and objective tool emerged during the Enlightenment, shaped by European practices that prioritize material precision and territorial authority. Yet these ideals disregard the diverse ways humans have historically conceptualized and represented spatial relations. Understanding maps as process emphasizes its dynamic nature, produced, circulated, and consumed within specific cultural and historical frameworks. This perspective invites a more nuanced approach of maps as artifacts of negotiation, memory, and meaning, rather than mere geographical tools. And I think it's very important to kind of bring that into the conversation. As we'll see later, the originator from the maps, or the prism of the map, really influences what it presents and how it represents it. So looking at the history of cartography, we explored this article by Neil published in 2020, in which they explore the transformative power of maps, ranking key milestones in which we redefine our perception of the world, starting with the Babylonian map of the world from 6th century BCE, which is one of the earliest examples of cartography, and although simplistic, it reflects the centrality of Babylon and the worldview of its creation. Two main themes that's explored in this article is the technology and how it influences us. The map of Ptolemy in Greece laid out the scientific foundations of map making, and this example of Tableau Rogeriano is from the golden age of Islamic map mapping, and it centers around Mecca. Then there's always these dragons that represents in the Renaissance, the maps are adorned by mythical creatures and dragons intended to fill uncharted spaces, both reflecting the imagination and the limitations of the time. This document in total underscores map as a tool of power, science, and art. By shaping perceptions of space, maps influence political boundaries, cultural identities, and scientific discovery. Moreover, maps serve as recorded records of human ambition, capturing the evolving intersection of knowledge and exploration. Looking at the function and characteristics of maps, here is just somewhat comprehensive list of what is found in the literature. We don't have time to go through all of them. What I really want to focus on today is the abstract and the symbolic representation of maps. So looking deeper into the abstract and symbolism characteristic of maps, I would be amiss not to include this well-known and often thrown around saying from Alfred Krzyzewski. Map is not the territory it represents. This quote means that our perception of reality is not really reality itself, but rather our version of it. It also suggests that our ability to see the world from different perspectives can help us get closer to the truth. Krzyzewski used this quote as part of a larger theory that states that our knowledge of reality is limited by our language, neurology, and perception organs, which implies that we can only ever know abstraction of reality, translating from one from another. And this abstraction and symbolism, I think it's key when looking at maps. Like there's two examples on the slide. It is a topographic representation of a hill where contour lines are used to show height. And through the advances of technology, the use of color, those representations of a 3D world on a 2D surface have just expanded and exploded. We've got a relief map which just uses shading to accurately indicate a 3D representation of South Africa in a 2D context. And I think this abstraction in the simplification of a limiting dimensional expression is very intriguing, and it's very foundational to understand once we start moving into the abstraction in the increase of complexity, when we start increasing dimensions and trying to find a way to represent more dimensional object in a three-dimensional space, or even in a two-dimensional space. That is what we will explore eventually. We're building up to it. So looking at how we can map consciousness, I think it's very pertinent through just the research of maps to understand that the frame of reference that we're looking at consciousness at influences how we are going to map it. So the prism of how we define our prism and the knowledge of the limitations and the expectations and the power differential in our prism influences very heavily how the map of consciousness is going to look like. For this paper, I've defined 3 key areas of mapping: the neurological mapping, psychological mapping, and spiritual mapping. So on a very rudimentary level, neurological mapping can be split into brain mapping and neural networks. Brain mapping uses techniques like fMRI and EEG to study brain activity associated with different states of consciousness, such as sleep, dreaming, meditation, and other altered states. The neurological networks explore the complex networks of neurons that underlie consciousness and how they interact and produce subjective experiences. You can see that neurological mapping is firmly based in the material worldview. Next, psychological mapping. If we look at Jungian psychology, which analyzes archetypes and symbols to understand the collective unconscious and the individual psyche. And cognitive psychology, which studies the mental processes like attention, memory, and perception to understand how they contribute to conscious experiences. Thirdly, spiritual mapping. The term mystical traditions explore practices like meditation, yoga, and shamanism to induce altered states of consciousness and gain insight from the nature of reality. Religious and philosophical systems, analyzing the teachings of various religious and philosophies to understand their views of consciousness and its potential. Why map consciousness? So one of the elements of maps or functions of maps is navigation and exploration. If you don't know where you are, you don't know where you need to go. And I experienced that with my first introduction to all the theories of consciousness last year, where I was completely overwhelmed. And I had no visual frame to place all these different ideas in. And I constructed a very rudimentary linear map or line, focusing on hard materialism on the one end and cosmopsychology, or the complete abstraction of materialism on the other end, and tried placing all these theories that we've been exposed to in a line just to make sense of where they fit in, to see the relational aspects of them. It is only through mapping that we can actually create a critical analysis. So now to kind of the meat and potatoes of this presentation, looking at consciousness as a multidimensional object. This article by Smithies 2012 explores the idea that consciousness might be related to higher dimensional spaces. In it, he suggests that the phenomenal consciousness and physical space could be integrated into higher dimensional frameworks, and proposes that our conscious experience might exist in a dimension beyond the familiar 3-dimensional space. To explore this diagram explains the concept of a 4th dimensional object using a tesseract or a 4-dimensional shape as an example. It starts by introducing dimensions progressively. In the 0 dimension, we've got a single point with no dimensions. In the first dimension, we've got 2 points connected by a line. The second dimension, a square formed by connecting lines, 4 points. The third dimension, the cube is formed by connecting squares. And therefore, in the 4th dimension, is introduced as the tesseract or hypercube, is this shape bound by 8 cubes connecting via a fourth dimensional axis called the W-axis. The most important thing to kind of take away from this abstraction of the diagram is that each higher dimension is formed by adding 2 sides of the previous dimension. So point, 2 points form a line. Line, 2 lines to form a square. Square, 2 squares to form a cube. Cube, 2 cubes to form a hypercube. Now, this video about fourth dimensional space explains what the shadow of a multi-dimensional object or an object in a higher dimension than we are can look like.
Imagine a 2D shape in a 2-dimensional world is visited by a 3-dimensional cube. On the left is a visual from the cube's perspective, penetrating the 2D plane. On the right is a bird's eye view of the cube's entry and exit from the 2D world. And the best illustration is the view of a sphere passing through a 2D plane from a flat square's perspective. The bar at the top of the screen shows you what the flat square sees. Cool, right?
Now, where would we find a shadow of such a 4-dimensional object? And hypothetically, we're going to use our school's logo, the Sri Yantra, which is an ancient symbol of interlocking triangles representing the meaning of heaven and earth, spirit and matter, masculine and feminine. The symbol has significant roots in various spiritual traditions, including Vedic, Tantric, and Western esoteric teachings. Its connection to CIIS is traced back to 1910. The Sri Yantra elaborates on the characteristics of creation's dynamic movement between spirit and matter, representing the integration of mind, life, body, soul, and spirit. So, for this argument, let's say this is the shadow of consciousness that is being represented in a 2-dimensional world through this logo. What would it look like in 3 dimensions? Traditionally, this is how the Sri Yantra is represented as a 3-dimensional element, kind of stacked on top of each other like a layer cake. And through modern technology, we can represent it in this way, where the triangles are actually interlocking, descending and ascending in a 3-dimensional world. Another way of representing it within a 3-dimensional cube world is through this kind of glass engravings. And what would that look like if we abstract it into a 4-dimension or 5th dimension or 6th dimension or 8th-dimensional world? And if it naturally exists as if consciousness naturally exists as a multi-dimensional object, how simplified are our versions of it within our 3D world? How much are we actually missing? And how much is our prism that we look through the walls influencing what we see? And I think in conclusion, and that not one theory holds all the truth. And like this shadow sculpture or light sculpture, multiple theories at a specific angle from a specific point of view create a specific picture. Thank you.